The secret operations of the Cold War didn't die with the Berlin Wall. They live on in modern surveillance, global power struggles, and the systems shaping everyday life. Subscribe to Cold War Black Files to uncover how yesterday's espionage still influences the world today. The sand came first. On February 26, 1991, the Iraqi desert transformed into a wall of brown fury. Winds screamed across the flatlands at 40 miles per hour, tearing visibility down to less than 1,000 meters. For the Iraqi Republican Guard's Tawakkalna division, this was a gift from God. They couldn't see the Americans coming, which meant the Americans couldn't see them either, or so they thought. 4 days earlier, the ground war of Desert Storm had begun. Saddam Hussein's forces were being systematically destroyed across Kuwait, but the Republican Guard, his elite formations, his best tanks, his most loyal soldiers, they were still intact, and they were dug in along a defensive line that stretched across the Iraqi desert, waiting to bleed the American advance. The Tawakkalna division held the center of this line. Over 10,000 men, more than 200 tanks, mostly Soviet-made T-72s, the backbone of armies from Warsaw to Baghdad. These weren't conscripts, these were Iraq's finest, battle-hardened from 8 years of war with Iran. They had prepared their positions carefully, hull-down defensive positions where only the turret of the tank showed above the sand, minimizing their profile. Trenches, berms, everything positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Their doctrine was Soviet, refined over decades of Cold War planning. Let the enemy advance into your killing zone. Open fire at 2,000 meters. Use superior numbers and prepared positions to overwhelm the attacker. The Iraqis had done this before. They had stopped human wave attacks from Iran with these same tactics, the same positions, the same tanks, and now they waited. In the sandstorm, invisible. Rolling toward them through that same storm was the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment of the United States Army. The 2nd ACR wasn't a massive formation. 9 troops of cavalry, about 4,000 soldiers total, with roughly 150 fighting vehicles. Their mission was simple in concept, brutal in execution. They were the advance guard, the eyes of 7 Corps. They would advance east until they found the Republican Guard. Then they would fix them in place and call in the heavy divisions behind them to finish the job. But finding an enemy in a sandstorm is like finding shadows in a coal mine. The Iraqis knew this. They were counting on it. What the Iraqis didn't know was that the Americans weren't using their eyes. Inside every M1A1 Abrams tank, rolling through that storm, behind every Bradley fighting vehicle's armored hull, were thermal imaging systems. Not night vision, not image intensification that amplified existing light. Thermal sensors that detected heat signatures. The difference is everything. Night vision needs light, even starlight, even the faint glow of a distant moon. Thermal imaging needs only heat. And a T-72 tank, even one buried hull down in the sand with its engine idling, radiates heat like a beacon. The Americans could see perfectly, through the sand, through the smoke, through conditions that rendered the Iraqis completely blind. This wasn't luck. This was the result of billions of dollars and decades of research that the United States had poured into military technology while the Soviet Union bet on mass and doctrine. The Americans had built an army that could see in the dark, shoot on the move, and kill from distances that would have seemed impossible just 10 years earlier. But technology means nothing if you don't know how to use it. And that's where training enters the story. Every tank commander in the 2nd ACR had spent months at the National Training Center in California, fighting against an opposing force that used Soviet tactics, Soviet formations, Soviet everything except Soviet soldiers. They had fought this exact battle dozens of times. They knew what the Republican Guard would do before the Republican Guard did it. They had practiced calling for artillery, coordinating with attack helicopters, moving in formation at speeds that would have terrified their predecessors. They had done it so many times that it wasn't conscious thought anymore. It was muscle memory. The Iraqi crews had training too. Soviet training. But Soviet training emphasized control from above, from commanders who could see the whole battlefield and direct their forces like chess pieces. In the sandstorm, those commanders were blind. Their carefully prepared defensive doctrine depended on seeing the enemy at 2,000 meters. They couldn't see past 500. At approximately 15:30 hours, elements of Eagle Troop, part of the 2nd Squadron of the 2nd ACR, crossed an imaginary line on the map designated as the 73 Easting. Easting lines run north to south, marking longitudinal coordinates. The 73 Easting was just another grid line. It would become immortal in the next 23 minutes. The first thermal signatures appeared on American screens. Vehicles, lots of them, dug in, exactly where the Republican Guard was supposed to be. Commands were passed, distances called out. The Bradley fighting vehicles moved forward, their 25mm chain guns tracking targets the naked eye couldn't see. Behind them, the M1A1 Abrams tanks moved into firing positions, their 120mm smoothbore cannons loaded with depleted uranium penetrator rounds that could punch through a meter of steel like it was cardboard. The Iraqis still couldn't see anything. Just sand, just wind, just the howling storm. Then the Americans opened fire. The first Iraqi tank exploded before its crew knew they were under attack. Then the second, then the third. Thermal imaging doesn't just let you see the enemy. It lets you see exactly where to shoot. Engine compartments, ammunition storage, weak points in armor. Every shot was aimed. Every shot was deliberate. The Iraqis tried to return fire. They shot at muzzle flashes, at sounds, at ghosts in the storm. Most of their rounds went wide. The few that found targets bounced off the frontal armor of the Abrams tanks or were defeated by composite armor that the Soviets didn't know how to penetrate. The American tanks were moving, firing on the move. This was something the Iraqi crews had been told was impossible. Soviet doctrine said you stopped to shoot. You found a position, you braced, you aimed carefully, then you fired. The Americans were hitting targets at 1,500 meters while traveling at 25 miles per hour across broken terrain. Their stabilization systems, their fire control computers, their training, all of it came together in a symphony of destruction. The Tawakalna division tried to fight back. Credit where it's due. They didn't break immediately. Republican Guard units attempted to maneuver, to return fire, to do something other than die in their positions, but they were fighting blind. American artillery began falling, not random barrages, but precision fires called in by forward observers who could see through the storm. Attack helicopters appeared overhead, their own thermal systems picking out targets and engaging with Hellfire missiles. Some Iraqi crews abandoned their vehicles and tried to fight as infantry. They lasted seconds. The Bradley fighting vehicles, designed to fight alongside tanks and carry infantry, tore through personnel with their chain guns. Other Iraqis tried to surrender, but in the chaos of combat, in the sandstorm, with communications breaking down and units disintegrating, surrender became almost as dangerous as fighting. The Americans kept advancing, not slowly, not cautiously, fast, aggressive. The second ACR had trained for this. Find the enemy, fix the enemy, destroy the enemy. The entire doctrine was a fence. Even their defensive positions were just places to shoot from before advancing again. 23 minutes after the first shot, it was over. The portion of the Tawakalna division that had occupied this section of the line had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Over 100 Iraqi armored vehicles destroyed. Dozens more abandoned. Hundreds of Iraqi soldiers dead. Hundreds more captured or fleeing into the desert. American losses in this engagement were almost nonically small. One Bradley fighting vehicle destroyed by enemy fire. A handful of wounded, no dead. The kill ratio wasn't 10 to 1. It wasn't 20 to 1. In some sectors, it approached 100 to 1. This wasn't battle, this was execution. But it was execution, based on technological and tactical superiority so overwhelming that it redefined what modern warfare meant. The Battle of 73 Easting continued into the night as more American units moved forward and engaged more Iraqi positions. By the morning of February 27th, the Tawakalna division had been effectively destroyed. Other Republican Guard divisions were falling back in chaos. The entire defensive line that Saddam Hussein had counted on to bleed the Americans had collapsed in less than 48 hours. But the implications of what happened at 73 Easting went far beyond one battle, one division, one war. Soviet military observers were watching Desert Storm very carefully. They had trained the Iraqis. They had sold them the tanks, the doctrine, the tactics. The T-72 was their export model, true, not their absolute best, but it was the same tank they had sold to Warsaw Pact nations, to client states around the world. It was supposed to be competitive. It wasn't. The Soviets had built their entire military strategy around mass tank warfare in Central Europe. Thousands of tanks rolling through the Fulda Gap, overwhelming NATO through sheer numbers and operational depth. They knew the Americans had better technology, but they thought numbers and doctrine would compensate. The math would work. For every American tank, they'd have 3 or 4 Soviet tanks. They'd take losses, sure, but they'd win through attrition. 73. Easting proved that math was a fantasy. When one side can see and the other can't, when one side can shoot accurately at 2,000 meters while moving, and the other has to stop to shoot at half that range, when one side's armor is impervious and the other's is tissue paper, numbers don't matter. You don't win through attrition when the attrition ratio is 100 to 1. The Soviet Union collapsed later that year for many reasons, but among those reasons was the sudden, terrifying realization that they had lost the Cold War's arms race more completely than they'd imagined. Everything they'd built, every tank, every doctrine, every carefully planned offensive, all of it was obsolete. Not outdated. Obsolete. There's a difference. Outdated means old, but still functional. Obsolete means useless. And that's what Desert Storm revealed. The Soviet military model was useless against an American military that had spent the previous 15 years rebuilding itself from the ground up. People forget what the American military looked like before the 1980s. Vietnam had broken it. Morale was destroyed. Drug use was rampant. Equipment was aging. The all-volunteer force was struggling to find recruits. Defense intellectuals talked seriously about whether the United States could defend Western Europe if the Soviets attacked. The answer wasn't clear. Then came the reforms, new training methods, realistic, hard, designed to simulate combat as closely as possible without killing people. New equipment, not just better tanks, but integrated systems where everything talked to everything else. New doctrine that emphasized speed, initiative, and combined arms warfare. New recruitment standards, new expectations. The military that fought at 73 Easting wasn't your father's army. It was something new. And it worked. The battle lasted 23 minutes. The aftershocks are still reverberating. Every military in the world studied Desert Storm. Many of them completely restructured their forces based on what they learned. Thermal imaging became standard. Network-centric warfare became the goal. The idea that you could win through mass alone died in the Iraqi desert. But there's something else worth noting about 73 Easting. Something that makes it different from a lot of military history. We know exactly what happened, down to the second, because the Americans recorded everything. Every tank had GPS tracking its position. Many vehicles had recording equipment logging their data. After the battle, analysts could reconstruct the entire engagement in 3 dimensions, watching how units moved, where they shot, what they hit. This became a training tool. New officers at West Point study the Battle of 73 Easting using simulations built from that data. They can make different decisions and see what happens. They can learn from the battle without having to fight it. That's another edge. The ability to learn, to analyze, to improve based on real data rather than vague after-action reports and conflicting memories. The sandstorm cleared on February 27th. The Iraqi desert was littered with burning vehicles. The Republican Guard, which had seemed so formidable just days before, had been shattered. A ceasefire was declared on February 28th. The war was over. Coalition casualties for the entire ground campaign were remarkably light. Iraqi casualties were catastrophic. Exact numbers are disputed, but tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers died. Thousands more were captured. The vast majority never saw the enemy that killed them. They died in a sandstorm, killed by tanks they couldn't see, firing weapons that couldn't penetrate, following doctrine that had become suicide. History remembers Desert Storm as an easy war, a 100-hour ground campaign, a one-sided victory. And it was. But easy victories don't just happen. They're built. They're the result of decades of preparation, training, investment, and hard lessons learned from previous failures. The Battle of 73 Easting represents a moment when warfare changed fundamentally, not gradually, not slowly, but in 23 minutes of violent, one-sided combat that demonstrated technology and training could overcome numbers and positions so completely that the old rules simply didn't apply anymore. The Iraqi soldiers at 73 Easting weren't cowards. They weren't incompetent. They were outmatched by an enemy fighting a different kind of war with tools they didn't have and couldn't see. They were, in a very real sense, fighting in the past, while the Americans were fighting in the future. And the future, on that day, was merciless. Subscribe to Cold War Black Files to uncover the hidden forces still shaping our world. Intriguing.